Sarah,
Yes,
it's Gail.
is that Gail? Yeah,
Yes, it is. The Fields and Thomas environmental review has been posted to the website so people can pull it up.
oh, fantastic, thank you so much.
Well, it's Tiffany we all get to thank.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, Sarah, how are you?
Good, how you doing?
Oh, just pleased and proud to be here.
Me too, after a week off, I don't know what to do. Waiting for a few more board members to join, then we'll get going. I see there's hands, yes,
Madam Chair, can you hear me? I'm at a different
Yes.
location tonight, and I'm just, yeah, okay.
no
Thanks.
problem.
All right.
I see that two people have their hands raised. We haven't started the meeting yet. Could you please lower your hands? Thank you. Looks like I have Sean, Brian, and John. Attorney Pucci's here. Looking for Jim and Catherine and somebody else.
Hello,
James,
Sarah.
Sarah.
There's Jim. So many people, I can't find anybody.
All right, you hear me okay?
I can, thanks, Sean.
Okay.
Looking for James and Catherine. Anybody see them? Well, it's 7:02 p.m. on Wednesday, June 8th. I have a quorum present. I'm sure that James and Catherine will join us shortly. So I'll call the Zoning Board of Appeals 40B meeting to order. And open the continued public hearing of the 40B application of Jeffrey Engler of SLV School Street LLC to be known as a sanctuary at Manchester by the Sea for a comprehensive permit under Mass General Laws, Chapter 40B, Sections 20 to 23, to construct a 136-unit apartment complex for which the Massachusetts Housing Finance Agency issued a project eligibility decision on September 16, 2021 at School Street, Assessors Map number 43, lot number 18, filed with the town clerk on September 27, 2021. Tonight, we plan on concentrating most of our time on the environmental peer review and environmental conditions and waiver requests. I will be taking public comment, but I will be limiting it to environmental issues tonight. I want to start with the fact that there was an article in today's Gloucester Times, which was inaccurate. It indicated the state had granted an extension of the public hearing to July 21st. That's not correct. Only the developer can agree to an extension, and it must be approved by the board at a public hearing. I would like to discuss that now. Currently, the public hearing is scheduled to end on June 22nd with one more meeting. At this point, we're waiting for the wildlife habitat vernal pool study, which I believe we're going to receive tomorrow. In addition, we're waiting for the municipal wastewater connection feasibility study. I believe Mr. Engler has indicated he will consider a 30-day extension. I did pull my board, and due to logistics in convening the board, we have challenges with meetings in July. I can't get sufficient number of people to a July 6th meeting, and our regular ZBA meeting is on July 20th. In order to have two meetings in July, we would need to meet on July 13th and July 27th. Therefore, I'm asking Mr. Engler if he would consider giving us an extension to July 20th. Mr. Engler.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. For the record, Jeff Engler from SLV School Street. As I indicated in my written correspondence, I would be amenable to that extension. Just so I'm clear, I guess July 13th, we're meeting on the 22nd, which was already scheduled. And then we'll meet on the 13th and the 27th. Is that right? Or whatever 2 weeks is from?
Yes, of July,
13th.
yes.
Right.
July.
So, yeah,
13th.
I can provide Mr. Pucci something in writing. Obviously, I don't need to do that tonight, but I'm on record as saying I'm comfortable with that extension, and I'll provide Mr. Pucci with something in writing confirming as much to his satisfaction. And then to the other point, the wildlife corridor and vernal pool study is done. I have seen it and read it. It is quite extensive. It's in draft format, and that, in fact, will be submitted this Friday, not tomorrow. One of the reasons we've granted the extension is because we know that's an important study to the town. We did not deliver on the June 1st expectation, so we want the peer reviewer, Beals and Thomas, who's been involved, to have adequate time to review that study. And we also think the additional time will be beneficial to clean up and finalize some of the water and sewer considerations. I'm sure the board has already seen Tata and Howard's letter relative to the water, which was, quite favorable from our perspective. So yeah, Madam Chair, that's a long-winded way of saying I'm comfortable with the extension as you've requested it.
Thank you. With that, I will make a motion to the board to accept the extension of the 40B public hearing until July 28th, 2022. Do I have a second?
Second.
Brian seconds. I'll take a roll call vote. Brian?
Yes.
Sean?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
John?
Approve.
Catherine?
Approve.
Is James on the line? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Sarah, just one thing, I'd recommend that extension go right over to the town planner or to Ms. Hunter, and then they will file that with the town clerk's office rather than go through me. I'm happy
Okay,
to
thank you.
review it if you need me to, but it should go to staff and then it can
Okay.
be filed with the town clerk.
Yeah, if it goes to Gail Hunter, that would be great.
That'd be great.
Yep, thank you. Okay. We will now move on to the environmental peer review. Today at around 4 p.m., we received an update from Beals and Thomas. Gail Hunter has indicated that Tiffany was able to load it to our website. So under 40B environmental, you should be able to have access to that if you wish to look at that. It was distributed to the board late this afternoon. So who from Beals and Thomas is going to speak to this?
Hi, Madam Chair, this is Stacy Minahan with Beals and Thomas I'll be addressing, and
Thank
Andrew
you.
will jump in as needed as well.
Can I ask a question to begin with? This is certainly not my area of expertise. I have read the state vernal pool regulations, which appears to me that if there's wildlife habitat, there might be a 100-foot buffer. If there isn't, it's just the edge of the pool. I believe the town has a 100-foot buffer, whether there's habitat or not. Can you just clarify the difference between the town and the state regulations for me?
Yes, I will. And Andrew, throughout this presentation, if I'm misspeaking, feel free to jump in. But so the state does not regulate vernal pools as a resource area in and of themselves. A vernal pool is considered a habitat feature of other resource areas. So when you have a vernal pool in a bordering vegetated wetland, it's a habitat feature of that BVW. The vernal pool is not itself a resource area that's protected. The state considers the habitat feature to be the basin itself when it is within another resource area. So in land subject to flooding, bordering vegetated wetland, riverfront area, etc. And then it considers the vernal pool habitat to be the area within 100 feet of the limits of the basin, but only to the extent that that 100-foot offset also lies within another state regulated resource area. So if you have a vernal pool in a bordering vegetated wetland and the edges of the wetland and the vernal pool are coterminous, they're the same, then there is no vernal pool habitat offset beyond the vernal pool basin. Does that make sense for what the state regulates? And then I'll go on locally.
Okay. I think so.
Okay. So then locally, Manchester by the Sea regulates a vernal pool as a resource area in and of itself. And the bylaw considers that vernal pool resource area to consist of the basin itself, plus 100 feet up gradient of the basin, regardless of if that 100 feet lies within another resource area or not. So for the resource area under the bylaw, you have the basin plus 100 feet, and that's your vernal pool. Then on top of that, there are 30-foot and 50-foot setbacks from the vernal pool resource area. So you'll go 130 feet away for, I get them mixed up, the no disturb, and 150 feet away for the no build zone.
Okay. If the state 100-foot limit applies as a resource area to the vernal pool habitat, does that extend the local town's buffer beyond that?
No, and just to reiterate, the state 100-foot is not a resource area. And, you know, in the case of the A-series vernal pools, for example, on this property, you wouldn't have a full 100 feet away from the vernal pool, because although the vernal pool is in a wetland, the edge of that vernal pool is closer than 100 feet to the edge of the bordering vegetated wetland that it lies within. So your bordering vegetated wetland is the limit of vernal pool habitat per the state. And then to answer the second part of your question, the state considerations of how vernal pools are treated would have, in my understanding, no bearing on the local and vice versa.
Okay, so they're independent.
Correct.
Catherine Howe, did you have a question on this?
Yes, a brief one. I just wanted to confirm, like, this is also not my area of expertise, but I have recently had reason to come across some cases in this area. So I just want to confirm my understanding and belief that our local bylaws are significantly more restricted than the Wetlands Protection Act. And so to the extent that we waive them, we're not going to be quote unquote covered by the state Wetlands Protection Act. Is that true?
Yes, that's how I would read your bylaws. Generally speaking, the local wetlands bylaw is more restrictive than the state act, and that's a requirement for bylaws. If a town enacts a local bylaw, in order to have legal standing, it has to be more restrictive than the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act. So you would not have the same coverage in terms of that Wetlands Protection Act review. Vernal pools are a good example where you wouldn't have that extra 100 foot, and then you wouldn't have the no touch zone and no build zone beyond that. That said, I think one thing for the ZBA to bear in mind as they're reviewing is the reason, and I'm sure there are attorneys on the call that can speak to this more eloquently than I can, but the reason for the Chapter 40B comprehensive permit process and the possibility for waiving local bylaw reviews is the need for affordable housing. And so the standard for the waiver granting is if a waiver is needed because it would make a project unbuildable, then that waiver, is typically granted. So the state has decided, to put it anecdotally, I suppose, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, but the state has decided that the need for affordable housing in certain instances trumps other needs, unless demonstrated otherwise. So, more important than environmental protection in certain areas.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Did any other member of the board have a question on this matter? No. So let's proceed through with the review that you presented to us today.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and thank you for bearing with us as we pulled the information together. There's been, as you know, a lot of back and forth and a lot of dialogue and narrative, and we wanted to make sure that we were reaching the end point of the three main items that the board had asked us to consider with regard to the waiver requests in particular. That's where the majority of the effort went for our review, just because that's a little bit of the stickier conversation. So a couple things I wanted to point out, and Madam Chair, if it pleases you, I'll just go through the letter and then folks can feel free to interrupt me as I'm going along.
Thank you.
So our letter is quite lengthy. That's because it includes all of the narrative and back and forth to date. So please don't take this letter as oh my gosh, there's 40 pages of new comments. The majority of it is things that were already previously discussed. We do that to maintain the administrative record. I would note here that I believe our next letter would be truncated. We wouldn't keep copying over kind of the same things that have been settled out. So just for the board's understanding. We also candidly struggled a bit with formatting in terms of trying to make things clear because the waiver requests have changed over time. So I did want to just introduce that the letter includes at the beginning, our comment one is the waiver table. We have updated the language from the applicant in the table as to the waiver requests and the support for that request. So that is not what the original language is. We've put in the latest language so that you can review that. Because of that, if you take the time to read back through our prior comments and the applicant's responses and some of that back and forth, it may not make as much sense because those comments were responding to slightly different versions or reasons of the waivers. So the way I review our letter is that the bold text is really where the focus is tonight in terms of where we stand now. A lot of our earlier information earlier comments were asking for information that now has been provided to support the evaluation. Obviously, as you noted, we're still waiting on some. So that's just some introduction so that hopefully the letter is not too overwhelming. So beginning with the first waiver request, it's a waiver from Wetlands Bylaw section 1.2.2, which relates to the use of home rule authority to protect vernal pools as an additional resource area. So this gets to Madam Chair and Ms. Howe, the questions that you were asking about the vernal pools, which is different than the Wetlands Protection Act. So we looked, I should start off by saying, at each of the waivers for 3 prongs as the board had requested. The necessity of the relief, why does the project need it essentially? If there were alternate methods of compliance, and then what the adverse of impact might be if the waiver were granted. So for this first waiver, which again relates to vernal pools as resource areas, the applicant provided an illustrative buffer exhibit that shows the limit of work in the context of the vernal pool local resource area and the associated buffer zones and offsets. There are 2 areas where work is located within the local vernal pool resource area. These are in the outer 100 feet of the vernal pool resource area. So again, it's not work within the basin or the water holding portion of the vernal pool. It's within that 100-foot offset that the bylaw imposes. Those 2 locations are west of the northerly A series vernal pool. And that's for the site driveway, grading, and a retaining wall. And then east of the R series vernal pool for some stormwater basin off grading. So that's why the project is requesting that waiver. There are 2 components that are located within the outer 100 foot of the local vernal pool resource area. And certainly, Mr. Engler, if I am misstating or misspeaking, the reasons for your waiver request, please let me know as well. So then in terms of alternate methods of compliance, for the stormwater basin off grading, it looked to us like there might be some potential to tighten up that grading and avoid work within the local vernal pool resource area. We've asked that the applicant take a look at that and advise. It might not be feasible, but it looked like there might be some room to avoid that particular location. That said, for the other area, for the site access driveway and the grading and the retaining wall west of the A series vernal pool, that is not going to be able to be pulled entirely out of the local vernal pool resource area. Again, perhaps the limit of work can be tightened up a bit and the impact can be reduced, but it is not possible to avoid that impact entirely.
What if there's habitat that's using that vernal pool and the driveway is impeding that? Is that something that's looked at? I know we don't have that study yet.
Yes, so that gets a bit to the third prong, the adverse impact of approval that the board asked us to look at. And I will say that especially with vernal pools and habitat in general, it can be somewhat of a subjective evaluation. For much of this, we've noted in our comment letter that we're deferring our final evaluation of potential adverse impact until we receive the wildlife habitat study and vernal pool study. I know when we were on site with the applicant's representatives, we talked to them about, including wildlife corridor information and looking at the site in terms of where might the critters come from? Does it make sense places that they won't be coming from? How does the development fit into that? So based on our discussions in the field, I'm hopeful and fairly confident that we'll be receiving a robust wildlife habitat study that will help inform that adverse impact assessment. So for this particular waiver, the potential adverse impact is a reduction in the natural and undisturbed area of locally jurisdictional vernal pools on site. So again, that outer 100 foot of the vernal pools. It's in those specific 2 areas that I noted. And I noted that the wildlife evaluation is forthcoming and we plan on reviewing that to inform the assessment. And then this is one where we have had some discussions with Mr. Engler at the prior hearings and in our comments where we really would like to see some construction level of detail to address, particularly near the A series vernal pool, the steep slopes, the height, the prominent ledge, and the fact that the limit of work is actually coming over the edge of the top of slope. So we have some concerns about potential adverse impacts just during construction and how that's going to be managed. And so we wanted to hear a little bit more about that. And I believe Mr. Engler did indicate that that would be provided. So again, deferring kind of our final evaluation until that information is received. Any questions on that particular waiver request, or should I keep going?
Does anybody on the board have a question? If so, raise your hand. Guess not.
Okay. The next waiver is from Wetlands Bylaw Section 2.2 relating to the definition of alter. So the local definition of alter includes some additional considerations that are not encompassed in the Wetlands Protection Act definition. The main difference from my review relates to the fact that the local definition includes the terms cumulative and incremental impacts, and those terms are not defined. And those are terms that aren't used in the State Wetlands Protection Act definition. So the applicant, I believe, is requesting this relief just due to the uncertainty that having undefined terms can present. Granting this waiver would mean that alter defers to the Wetlands Protection Act definition, which would not require an evaluation of cumulative or incremental impacts. There are a few other differences, but they're fairly minor and not particularly substantive, I don't think, for this project. This is one, honestly, where it's not entirely clear to us why denying this waiver would result in the project being unbuildable, which was part of the applicant's narrative. But we do acknowledge that there is uncertainty that comes along with it. And so perhaps just for kind of comfort or peace of mind that the waiver is sought. The applicant had noted that there would be a written statement as to whether or not the project can meet that regulations test for significant, immediate, or cumulative adverse effect, that would be more appropriate for the notice of intent stage. But I did just want to note that that won't happen in the notice of intent stage, because the notice of intent will be filed just under the Wetlands Protection Act, which doesn't have that requirement for such a cumulative or incremental impact. So, just to dive in a little bit more for this one, the reason it wasn't clear to me why a waiver was necessarily needed is, so a cumulative or incremental impact analysis is what's asked for. And this is a site that's largely undeveloped. So, cumulative impacts would really be limited to if there was some existing area of the site that was already developed outside of this proposed footprint, and then you're going to add those together. Incremental, I think of things like, lawn creep of future owners or dumping or things like that, which would seem less likely to go with this sort of kind of managed development. But again, we do acknowledge the applicant's concern about the undefined terms, and it's our understanding that that's likely the large reason that the waiver is requested. There's also some vagaries in that, it doesn't specify on-site versus off-site. So are the cumulative impacts just on-site, or are they just off-site? So I think there's reason enough to request the waiver, although to us, it seems like the project would be able to comply with this particular requirement of the bylaw. In terms of, sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Engler has his hand raised. Let me
sorry.
see if he has something to contribute. Mr. Engler?
Thank you. I would just mention that, Stacy's analysis, I think, is excellent, but she's subjectively interpreting what cumulative or incremental might be. She really has no idea, and I think she would admit that. And we feel very uncomfortable moving forward in a process where definitions are not defined and not clear, because they're open to interpretation, and they could expand and expand and expand way beyond what Ms. Minahan has theorized or hypothesized. So we feel very strongly about our request for this waiver.
Thank you.
And we don't take exception to the waiver. I would not wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Engler in that I think the bylaw does provide some guidance on what cumulative and incremental means, but I certainly do acknowledge that the terms are undefined, and I think there is some uncertainty that could be brought in there. And I certainly acknowledge the concerns, and I don't take issue with the request for the waiver. This is one where looking at kind of the next two prongs, the next one being alternative methods of compliance. This isn't really applicable to this particular waiver because it's more of a kind of process waiver. You either provide the analysis or you don't. There's kind of no other way to comply. There's no alternate. You either do the analysis or you don't. So if a waiver is granted, I think that's not inappropriate. And then in terms of adverse impacts of approval, I noted that because of the existing character of the site, where you don't have a lot of areas that are historically significantly disturbed outside of the footprint, because of the character of the development, we don't take particular exception to this waiver request.
Any questions from the board on this one?
I assume that you don't take exception means that you don't have any issue with us granting that waiver?
Correct, yes, and I think that's because I don't see a significant potential
Thank you.
for adverse effect from the waiver being granted, yes.
Anyone else? Okay,
The next waiver is Wetlands Bylaw, Section 2.9, vernal pool. This is the definition of vernal pool. This is very similar to the prior discussion we had at the beginning about vernal pool as a resource area, vernal pool as a larger resource area than under the Act, and the associated setbacks. So I won't go through it again, but it's the same conversation. There are two areas where work is proposed within the outer vernal pool boundary. And I think we're awaiting the wildlife habitat study to assess the potential adverse impact. Wetlands Bylaw, Section 4.1.1, jurisdiction. They are requesting a waiver for the vernal pool resource area section again. And they've noted again the wildlife habitat assessment that will be forthcoming and will demonstrate no impairment of vernal pool function. So in terms of the necessity of relief, let's see, sorry, I just want to make sure I don't miss anything here, if there's anything different than before. So this is one where we had noted that we weren't quite clear why the waiver request was needed because the vernal pool and wildlife habitat study will demonstrate no impacts to resource areas as reported by the applicant. However, again, I am presuming that it's to avoid the uncertainty that goes along with the language in this section of the bylaw. Granting the waiver would make vernal pools not a resource area themselves. They'd be a feature within other wetlands, as we've talked about before. The extent of the area subject to jurisdictional review would be reduced. Again, you'd be looking just within existing wetlands and not 100 feet beyond. And we deferred the adverse effect evaluation to receipt of that wildlife habitat study. So this is a very similar, there's multiple overlapping vernal pool related waivers because of how it's addressed in the bylaw. Wetlands Bylaw, Section 4.4, jurisdiction and presumption. This is specifically 4.4.1 and 4.4.2. They're requesting waivers because work is required within resource areas and within 30 feet of resource areas. This provision of the bylaw indicates that unless it's demonstrated by clear and convincing evidence that a significant adverse effect will not occur, it shall be presumed that significant adverse effects occur in a resource area or within 30 feet of a resource area. With regard to the necessity of relief, the project does require work within resource areas and within 30 feet of resource areas. So more specifically, there's work within the riverfront area. And then there is also the stormwater management system off-grading and the driveway that I noted in the local vernal pool resource area. For the for the alternate methods of compliance, there to us do not appear to be alternate methods because access from other locations, either Old School Street or School Street, would result in more wetland impacts than what's currently proposed within the riverfront area. And then for the stormwater basin and the site driveway, there's no alternative that we can see to reduce or remove that impact within the 30-foot no disturb to the vernal pools. For adverse impacts considerations, the applicant noted that no significant adverse effect will be demonstrated in the wildlife habitat study. We're deferring closure of this comment to receipt of that document for this item as well.
Any questions? Guess we can go on.
Okay. Wetlands bylaw section 6.1, applications and fees. This relates to essentially the chapter 40B process where the waiver is indicating that the notice of intent will be filed purely under the Wetlands Protection Act. So granting this waiver is consistent with how the comprehensive permit process unfolds, with the Zoning Board of Appeals taking ownership of the local bylaw review. For alternate methods of compliance, it's again not particularly relevant because this is a procedural waiver. And adverse impact possibilities, there is no specific adverse impact of approval. This waiver again just reflects the fact that the zoning board is overseeing the local wetlands bylaw review, and the Concom will undertake a Wetlands Protection Act review of the notice of intent.
Any questions from the board on this? No?
Wetlands bylaw section 9, this relates to standards of review for application under the local bylaw. They're requesting a waiver from the entire section, indicating that enhanced standards and burdens of proof could nullify the project, and that again, with this wildlife habitat study that will be submitted, the project will be shown to not adversely impact the interest in the Wetlands Protection Act. So for necessity of relief, this section has multiple subsections, some of which are administrative and some of which are more substantive. So I'm just going to briefly go through them. 9.1 through 9.6, 9.12, and 9.16 appear to us to be procedural considerations, which wouldn't seem to need a waiver given the comprehensive permit process that's at play. That said, we take no issue with the waiver. I don't think there's an adverse impact if you approve it. It's more of an administrative matter. Section 9.7 presumes that the buffer zone is important to protecting the resource areas, and that impacts therein have a high likelihood of adverse impact. Again, the applicant has indicated that they'll be demonstrating that not to be the case with the forthcoming wildlife habitat study, but this is a more onerous standard than under the Wetlands Protection Act, which is presumably why a waiver is being requested. Section 9.8 generally mirrors certain riverfront area standards contained in the act. So it's not completely clear that a waiver is required, but at the same time, I don't think there's an issue with one being granted in terms of potential adverse effects. Section 9.9 addresses wetland replication as mitigation, which is not applicable to this project since there's not wetland replication required or proposed. Section 9.10 relates to wildlife habitat studies. Again, there is a wildlife habitat study being undertaken, but I think granting this waiver would provide some certainty to the applicant in terms of the scope of the wildlife habitat study. This language in the bylaw is fairly broad and allows kind of a broad requesting of various information. So presumably that's why the waiver is requested. And then section 9.11 presumes that vernal pools and the adjacent area provide essential habitat functions. For the alternate methods of compliance, again, not particularly relevant to this section because this section relates more to dictating to the town how it should review certain aspects of a project and include certain design standards. And again, multiple of the section 9 pieces are administrative in nature. So in terms of adverse impact or potential adverse impact of approval, to the extent relevant, we feel the applicants undertaking the studies that are noted in section 9, the wildlife habitat study, for example, the vernal pool evaluation. Other subsections to us don't appear germane or they mirror the act already. So if a waiver is granted, it would still be addressed under the notice of intent with the Conservation Commission. So we don't see an adverse impact of approving this waiver.
Any questions from the board on this one? Jim, are you talking? You're on mute.
I'm
Felix?
talking and I was on mute. Thank you. I put it on mute because I'm coughing a lot. May I ask Ms. Minahan,
Mhm.
have you concluded your remarks, or are you still continuing on?
I'm still continuing on, but I'm happy to pause.
No, I'll hold my comments until you finish, if you don't.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Thank you.
The next waiver requested is from sections 2.17 and 2.18 of the regulations. This relates to the no build and the no disturb zones that we've discussed previously. This is actually the definition of those two zones. The waiver is being requested because of components of the project that are proposed within these zones. And they've also added waivers later on that I'll touch on to actually request a waiver from the section of the regulations that has a performance standard related to it. Again, this is just a definitional section, so it's not clear that a waiver is needed, but I suppose it makes it clear that they're requesting a waiver from all aspects of it. So again, certain components of the project lie within the 30-foot no disturb zone and the 50-foot no build zone to vernal pools. Again, that's the vernal pool basin, 100 feet away. And then on top of that, there's a 30-foot no disturb zone and a 50-foot no build zone. And it's within the outer parts of that 100 and then within the 30 and within the 50 where work is proposed. Again, it's the site driveway, some of the stormwater features. Alternatives to this particular waiver are not applicable because it's a definition section. We discuss it further later that I'll go through in the other section. In terms of potential adverse impacts, the project requires the waiver to achieve the design. It doesn't appear, because of the way the site driveways or the site is laid out, and the existing characteristics of the site, it doesn't appear that work can be maintained outside of those no-touch zones for the stormwater and the driveway. I would note, with consideration of potential adverse impacts, this goes back to what I mentioned towards the beginning, where there are, very steep, very tall slopes, a lot of ledge, a lot of challenging construction conditions. And we think diligence and monitoring during that construction period will be required to mitigate the risk of adverse impacts. And that's why we were seeking some of that construction period information as well to inform the evaluation of adverse impacts.
And who would be responsible for monitoring that? Be a
So
third party?
typically it's been a third party when I've been involved, although municipalities, and Mr. Engler, I'm sure you have experience with this as well and can speak to it, but sometimes a municipality will require a separate third party. Sometimes a municipality will allow an applicant to hire their own, appropriately credentialed professional or appropriately experienced professional to do it and to submit reports. Sometimes a municipality has staff where they're able to undertake it. So I think any of those options could be undertaken.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Engel.
Correct. She's correct. I'm making a presumption here, but I don't think the municipality has an extensive or robust internal staff. So what the town may consider is, during construction, having Beals and Thomas serve as the third party monitor. They're as familiar with the site at this point as anybody and the type of construction and what's being proposed. So they may serve in that function, but it's certainly the town can make the determination whether what they want to handle that in-house, or they want to hire Beals and Thomas, or they want to hire some other third party. But
Okay.
usually in my experience, the consultant that's been involved throughout the process, it stands to reason that they're familiar with the town's expectations. They've reviewed the project for the most part, so they would probably have the shallowest learning curve to make sure that the project is meeting the standards that have been established.
Thank you.
And in addition to that monitoring, I do think if the construction period information will be forthcoming, that will be helpful as well, just to have an understanding. You know, this isn't a site where a simple silt sock, given the ledge and the steep slopes and things like that, and the way the work's coming over will be sufficient. But if not, you know, if that information isn't part of this review process, then perhaps a condition where it's provided ahead of the start of construction so that there can be some back and forth and coordination.
Well, if I may comment on that, as a condition to the building permit, as we said many times, we will be submitting an extensive construction management plan. However, you know, in deference to some of the concern from Beals and Thomas, as I indicated, I have reached out to a, you know, credible general contractor, site contractor, blasting contractor, and we're trying to get, you know, at least some preliminary information on how those activities will be handled, you know, during construction. That will be kind of a preview, if you will, to the full and detailed CMP plan that would be a requirement prerequisite of the building permit. But we are attempting to get that, and I will have something, you know, for Beals and Thomas to look at. I think the extension is, you know, will be helpful, although I do hope to have that in the next week or two.
Great. I think that will be helpful. And I think that approach is certainly appropriate. We're not needing a, you know, detailed soup to nuts, you're ready to break ground tomorrow type construction management plan. Okay, so Madam Chair, and for those following along, I am now on page, if you did download it, I'm on page 25 of our letter. And there are kind of multiple comments where we had some back and forth with the applicant and there's really no further action needed, or where the brunt of the discussion happens towards the end of the letter. So I'll go through those fairly quickly. So our comment number 2, if you're following along, was just noting that they had not at the time originally requested a waiver from the 50-foot no build zone. They have since requested that waiver. We touched on it briefly during the table, and I'll talk about it again at the end when we go through the new waivers that have been requested. Comment 3 related to, comment 3 related to bordering vegetated wetland impacts associated with the then proposed wastewater line and the directional drilling. That's no longer relevant to the project, so there's nothing needed on that comment. Comment 4 relates to the waiver of the 100-foot portion of the vernal pool boundary. Again, we've discussed that elsewhere, so I won't go through it in detail here. Comment 5 related to, again, clarifying waivers, so I'll go through that at the end. Comment 6 related to the hydrology and wanted to ensure that the wetland resource area hydrology won't change pre versus post construction. There also was an additional waiver requested for the definition of alter. The original waiver request for the definition of alter only requested a waiver from the cumulative and incremental portions of that definition. The current waiver request is a waiver from the full definition of alter. There is note, I think, in the applicant's commentary, if I remember correctly, that there will be some changes in existing drainage characteristics and flow patterns, and that's included in the definition of alter, and that's why they're requesting a waiver from that. I would just note that the Wetlands Protection Act does include similar language that changes in drainage characteristics and changes in flow patterns is considered an alteration in a resource area. So that will be addressed somewhat in the Wetlands Protection Act. So for this particular waiver, we discussed the alter waiver request previously. And again, just wanted to note that it would be largely addressed under the Act. There could be situations where if the vernal pool waiver is granted, then certain aspects of the site won't be subject to jurisdiction that would otherwise be, but where the whole site is subject to stormwater review, this isn't something that we are concerned about. We had several wetland resource area comments, which I believe all or largely all have been addressed, so I'm going to skip over them. But if you would like us to talk through the back and forth, let me know at the end and I can jump back. But I'm jumping now to comment 10, which was just noting the critical areas present on the site, which are the Sawmill Brook Coldwater Fishery and the various certified and certifiable vernal pools on the site. There have been some revisions to the stormwater analysis and design. The applicant provided a thorough response regarding and confirming that they had addressed what was required to be addressed for discharges to or near critical areas. We did review that and feel that the comment has been appropriately addressed.
I was under the understanding that a change in the tree canopy could adversely impact the coldwater fishery by raising the temperature so they wouldn't spawn anymore. Is there any type of guidelines on that?
There's no guidelines per se. I think certainly if you are, clearing tree canopy or cover along and changing the shading regime of a stream, that can certainly have an impact. I wouldn't necessarily anticipate that with the distance from the brook where the limit of disturbance lies.
Okay.
Comment 11 had just been some back and forth about showing the vernal pools, which are now all shown on the revised plans. And again, just to clarify in case I was not clear at the beginning. So what the applicant has done is submitted a revised plan set with existing conditions plans and proposed conditions plans as well. And those show all of the vernal pools that were noted in the field. Then separately, there's an illustrative buffer zone exhibit, and that's the exhibit that shows the limit of work and the setbacks that are associated with the vernal pools. And presumably that's because they're requesting waivers from multiple of the setbacks, and so they're not depicted on the main plan set. But for reference, that illustrative buffer zone exhibit is what is helpful and what we used when we were looking at what work, requires the waiver that's being requested. Comment 12, we had asked and they did provide an isolated land subject to flooding calculation for a small isolated area. It does not qualify as ILSF. This was a feature that we were not expecting to qualify as ILSF, but it's always better to actually have the calculation to prove it out, which they have done. Comment 13, we were looking for the applicant to document why a flood study is not needed, given that FEMA hasn't identified a flood elevation. They have done that. We wanted it for the administrative record in terms of the FEMA zone A is, significantly down gradient from the proposed limit of work. So we're comfortable with the response that they provided. Comment 17, I'm skipping to now, is the next one that had a remaining item. This related to an initial recommendation we had given to consider incorporating time of year restrictions into the construction schedule, given the prevalence of vernal pools on site and the fact that animals are migrating to and from them during the spring breeding season. I think the applicant has indicated they feel strongly that that's not necessary and that can be mitigated, that migration can be mitigated otherwise. We're deferring closure of this comment to receipt of the information that the applicant has noted regarding the wildlife habitat study for this item. Let's see. Comment 24, we had just recommended that the landscape plans show a broader viewport so that it would be clear where lawn versus meadow mix is proposed, and they've made that revision to the viewport. 25 discusses wildlife habitat considerations. So similarly, we're deferring closure of this comment to receipt of the wildlife study. Comment 26, we had noted that there were shadow studies included in the submission and had just asked that sensitive receptors like the vernal pools and the brook be added to them, which they have been. And it doesn't appear that there will be, significant shading changes to those areas. So those were our general comments. And then what we did, as I mentioned in the beginning, is at the end of our letter, starting on page 38, we've listed the new waivers that have been requested since the original. So our comment 27 relates to section 10.1, the 30-foot no disturb zone and the 50-foot no build zone. I won't go through this again because I've gone through it previously when we discussed it. I will just say that again, it does not appear feasible to remove the work from these zones in terms of the adverse impact of approval. The majority of the work proposed within the 30-foot and 50-foot zones appears to be within areas of ledge outcrops. If this waiver were granted, there'd be a net reduction of the extent of natural local setbacks within these portions of the landscape, but again, deferring our final evaluation to receipt of the wildlife study, since I think that will contain relevant information. Our comment number 28 relates to a waiver from regulation section 4.4.2, delineation and review of vernal pools. This was one where the waiver didn't appear necessary to us because the applicant has conducted a very thorough and detailed vernal pool study during the appropriate breeding season and time of year, and has documented that all of the features that were noted as possible vernal pools are indeed functioning as such. This waiver doesn't have alternate methods of compliance. That's just not relevant to this waiver request. Adverse impact of approval in granting the waiver, there does not appear to be any adverse impact because again, all of the on-site vernal pools have been confirmed to be certifiable. So this might just be one that for comfort and administrative reasons, the applicant wants it, because of how it's framed, but we would consider that this section has essentially been complied with as far as we can tell by the applicant.
Correct, but we would still like it because your interpretation may be different than other people's interpretation.
Yep, understood. Waiver request, Beals and Thomas comment 29, waiver request from Wetlands Regulations section 8.2, clear and convincing standards regarding the burden of proof. So the applicant is requesting this waiver as it pertains to work within resource areas and the no disturb zone. Essentially, this section of the bylaw indicates that the proponent carries the burden of proof to demonstrate that there will be no significant immediate or cumulative adverse effect. And again, our understanding is that the concern and the reason for requesting this waiver is that certain of the terms used in this standard are undefined. Alternate methods of compliance. I think, again, it's more of a procedural one, so that's not particularly relevant. It's not a design issue. Adverse impact of approval. The applicant has noted that their forthcoming information will demonstrate no adverse impact, presuming that that is received and agreed with, and that the construction period information that we had asked for is received and addresses, protection of those areas. We wouldn't see an adverse impact of granting this waiver request. Because essentially they've done what we would have considered to be meeting that burden of proof. Again, to Mr. Engler's point, that can be interpreted differently, and hence the waiver request. Our comment 30 is a waiver from section 9.7, standard for review of vernal pools. This section allows the commission to ask for more information and additional documentation, alternatives analysis. Again, we have the wildlife habitat and vernal pool study forthcoming, so it's hard to assess whether the project will comply anyway or won't, but I'm sure that it's a waiver that they would continue to seek because of the uncertainty with the language. And again, we're deferring the review of potential adverse effects to receiving that wildlife study. Our comment 31, they have a new waiver request from the Wetlands Regulations, section 12.4, mitigation requirements. So the regulations require mitigation for work in the 30-foot no disturb zone and for work within the 50-foot no build zone. That mitigation, some examples that are included in the regulations includes, incorporation of native plantings, invasive species control, restoration of lawn or other disturbed areas to a more natural state. Currently, the applicant has not formally proposed mitigation along those lines, although they have noted a willingness to incorporate invasive species management to avoid further kind of propagation on the property of invasive species. And I believe they are also incorporating some native plantings in their landscape design. So alternative methods of compliance would be for the applicant to look at the proposed design and see if any of the currently proposed aspects would qualify as mitigation and to document those. And then also see if there are other aspects that could be incorporated to meet the requirement. There are specific ratios that are noted as being required. The adverse impact of approval, if the waiver is granted, there'd be a reduction in the required on-site mitigation for work in those 30 and 50-foot zones. That would result in fewer natural areas than if mitigation was required. We'd like to defer evaluation to receipt of the wildlife study. But one other thing I will note with regard to this waiver request is it may become moot if the board waives the vernal pool requirements, because the work within the 30-foot and the 50-foot no-build zone is from the vernal pool 30-foot and 50-foot no-build zones. And that was the final one of our comments. So thank you for allowing me to take the time to go through them.
Thank you. Jim Dietrich, did you have some questions or comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would direct this question to Ms. Minahan. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, Stacy?
You are. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. My question is, obviously, I don't believe anyone on the board has your familiarity with these environmental concerns, and that's why you're reviewing this for us. It seems like our town regulations are more stringent or get into areas that the state, for whatever reason, does not feel necessary to address. Is that a reasonable statement?
Yes, the local regulations are more protective and expansive, both in terms of the area that's subject to jurisdiction and also the performance standards and requirements for work within areas subject to jurisdiction.
Is
Is that partly because we're an oceanfront community rather than an inland community?
I don't think, well, I can't speak, I guess, to specifically why Manchester by the Sea adopted the regulations, but I will say there are many towns, including inland towns, the majority of towns in Massachusetts have adopted local bylaws, and many of those are significantly more restrictive.
Okay.
Why do you, excuse me, but why do you suppose that is?
Home rule authority is very interesting in Massachusetts.
Say again.
So home rule authority is a very interesting aspect of land use regulation in Massachusetts. I think for the towns that adopt the bylaws, there are all different reasons that municipalities do it, but a lot of times they are more familiar with features in their municipality. If you're looking at it from the aspect of, why doesn't the state regulate these things, if that's your question, I can't really speak to that. The act was created, a long time ago. Revising it is very difficult. They have over time added jurisdictional areas, in 97 when they added the Rivers Protection Act, and, they'll make additional improvements, but I don't know offhand, why they decided to regulate vernal pools as a habitat feature instead of a resource area, for example.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Brian, did you have any questions?
No, not at this time. It appears that we're still need the habitat studies before we can really make any real discussions at this point. So I'm done for right now.
We can't hear you, Brian.
You couldn't hear a thing I said?
No, your volume is either turned down or.
Well, I apologize. I'll speak louder. How's that? My point is, is that at this point, until we get a full understanding of the impact on the wildlife studies, it's premature to even just a lot to discuss at this point, I think.
Sean,
I don't have anything to add at the moment.
John?
I have no questions at this time. Thanks.
Catherine?
I have no questions right now. Thank you.
Is there any member of the Conservation Commission on that has any questions? I think they got it very late today, so I'm not sure they had a chance to look at it.
Yes, this is Steve Gang.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You're right, it was only received recently, so it's gotten only a quick review and only by me. So I can't speak for the Conservation Commission, but I guess one thing that struck me is that toward the end, number 29, Stacy, the waiver request pertaining to the burden of proof,
Yes.
which you interpreted as having to do with the possibly ambiguous terms cumulative and incremental impact. But we would interpret, I think, as lawyers would, as a standard of proof, because we have both clear and convincing standard in our bylaw. We also have preponderance of evidence. And just for layman's terms, generally preponderance of evidence means more likely than not, so greater than 50% likely. And clear and convincing means a larger likelihood, maybe 80% or something like that, so 4 times out of 5. And that's what I thought the waiver pertained to, was reducing the standard of the burden of proof down for all matters, not simply those that fall under the cumulative or incremental impact or under a particular jurisdictional resource. Can you comment on that interpretation?
Yes, and if I'm understanding you correctly, so I agree, preponderance and versus clear and convincing, as you've noted it. So I guess what I was intending to convey, and Mr. Engler, correct me if I'm wrong, but the clear and convincing, to your point, I don't believe was defined in the bylaw or regulations, and I think that was concerning, and therefore a waiver requested. I certainly don't want to speak for the applicant, but that was my understanding. That clear and convincing standard regarding the burden of proof for kind of no adverse impact, though I would interpret, if I don't know if I misunderstood what you said at the end, I would interpret as being of the areas subject to the bylaw unless otherwise waived as part of this process. Is that what you were driving at?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, so I agree. I agree with what you said.
Okay. In other words, the bylaw standards would remain intact for any bylaws or regulations that were not waived in the comprehensive permit.
The bylaw standards would remain intact for anything that wasn't waived. But if this 8.2 waiver is granted, then there would not be a clear and convincing standard requirement, regardless of whether another aspect was waived or not.
Right. And therefore, I view this waiver request as having to do with burdens of proof and not definitions of cumulative or incremental impact.
Yes, so there's 2 different waiver requests. 29 is from section 8.2, and then there's a different waiver request from the definition of alter that deals with the cumulative versus incremental.
Yes, I understand that. I just saw that you had combined them or conflated them in your description. And I wanted to be clear that reducing the burden of proof across all matters before the relating to local bylaw is a significant and different waiver.
Yes.
It doesn't pertain simply to vernal pools. It doesn't pertain simply to questions of cumulative or incremental impact. It would cover all jurisdictional matters before under the local law.
Yes.
So
And I
I'm
think
curious,
yeah, so
why you would support, or why anyone would support a change in the burden of proof standards. Is there anything imprecise about clear and convincing? It's been in legal doctrine for at least a century. Very well defined in precedent. It's one of those terms that does not require, in my legal opinion, but I'd be interested in Attorney Pucci's. One of those terms that does not require a specific definition.
And I would certainly defer, to the attorneys involved in that. In terms of preponderance versus clear and convincing, it's not, given the amount of information that the applicant will be providing once that's forthcoming, presuming that, it's thorough and addresses the concerns. I wasn't necessarily seeing, I guess I was thinking that their information would address sufficient of a standard so that there would be comfort that an impact wouldn't happen, but that's part of the reason that we need that wildlife study and construction information to make that final evaluation. And again, it's somewhat subjective. There's not a clear black and white answer.
Quite true. That's why we have judgment calls from volunteers who are trained and certified. But I guess a more general comment, thank you for your response about that. A more general comment pertains to the local protection of vernal pools and the evidence from even prior to Mr. Engler's interest in this property that its primary wetland value was the prevalence of vernal pools. Environmental scientists who've looked at it, such as Michael DeRosa, previous to this, recall exactly that. So it seems to me it is a kind of a poster child or test case for the reasons for local bylaws. So with that in mind, I was simply going to urge that the ZBA request exactly every bit of what the applicant would normally bring in a notice of intent to the Concom, because my understanding is to make this determination of a waiver, the ZBA needs to stand in the stead of the Concom. And to do that, they can't say, well, we'll put in a condition assuming that things will all become clear later on. I think that's all I need to say.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. Engler, do you have any thoughts?
I don't. I mean, I think in fairness to Ms. Minahan, I think she's been really thorough, but I think it's clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the board is kind of going to defer some of its final judgment until we submit the wildlife corridor and vernal pool analysis, which we've indicated we will this week. And then I guess we'll find time at a future hearing to reconvene on this issue and go through everything within the context of Beals and Thomas's review of that study. I think our waiver list speaks for itself. We just frankly do not want any room for interpretation or subjectivity. We plan to file our notice of intent with the Conservation Commission under the Wetlands Protection Act, and we believe all the work that we've submitted to date and will be submitting before the close of the public hearing is adequate for the board to make a decision and grant the necessary waivers we think we've demonstrated are necessary to build the project. The board raises a couple good questions. I've obviously worked in over 100 towns in Massachusetts, and most towns have more stringent conservation bylaws than what the state requires. And I can also say if all of those bylaws were upheld, Massachusetts would have probably approved and built about 20% of the housing units that have been built to date. And I would also say that, respectfully to Manchester by the Sea and the state size, these vernal pools and resource areas are no more important or less important than vernal pools and resource areas in Sudbury or Peabody or Randolph or Gloucester or Pembroke. I mean, the state looks at it, they don't specifically look at Manchester by the Sea versus another town, they look at the regulations. And I think Beals and Thomas in their other report on civil engineering has indicated that our stormwater management strategy and infrastructure, I don't speak for them, but meets all state standards. And we believe that what we've done, I mean, we've looked at this project 7 ways to Sunday relative to the road access, relative to the, stormwater management. And we'll look at it again, but it cannot be materially redesigned. I think Ms. Minahan may have raised that question early on in her comments. Believe me, we've looked, Alan and Majors, and our team has looked exhaustively. So I guess we'll defer future comment until we submit the study later this week, give Beals and Thomas adequate time to look at it within the context of our requests, and look forward to hopefully closing this out at a future hearing, this particular exercise. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Minahan, if this report is released on Friday, what would your timing be to respond to it? We have a meeting scheduled on the 22nd of June, which is probably too soon, and July 13th would be the next one.
Yeah, the 27th would be too soon. We had planned now, so Andrew's been to the site several times. I've been to the site as well. We had planned, though, once we had reviewed the wildlife habitat study, to go back to the site again, just to walk it with it in our hands to see kind of the areas they're talking about and kind of re-review. So I would like to ideally leave time for that to happen, for us to review and then go to the site and then write our letter. So I think the July 13th certainly would be feasible, if that's the next one after the 27th.
Yep, that would be fine.
Okay.
And Ms. Minahan obviously can coordinate directly with our team for full access, and they probably should walk the site together, I would presume.
Yep, that's fine with me. Okay. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to public comment strictly regarding environmental issues. I know that we've received many letters from the public, and many of them have referenced walking the trails and seeing a project. Any reference to walking the trails would be more appropriate to discuss when we do the architectural review. So tonight I'm only going to be taking questions on the environmental factors. I want to remind people that the purpose of the public hearing is to collect information so we can make a decision. It's not an easy thing to say we're denying this comprehensive permit. There's many more aspects involved than that. So I've received many letters saying just deny it and have it go away. It won't go away if we just deny it. So we need to consider everything, every opportunity we have regarding this project. Mr. Legere.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Luke Legere, McGregor, Legere, and Stevens on behalf of the Citizens Initiative for Manchester Affordable Housing. Just briefly, because as has already been touched on, I would agree that really until we see the wildlife habitat study and get some more details on the construction management plan, it's impossible at this point, I think, to really understand the nature and extent of the negative impacts of this project. And I think the Beals and Thomas letter makes that fairly clear. I would just like to take this opportunity to remind the board that at least with respect to the waivers that we've been discussing here so far this evening, the ZBA may deny waiver requests unless and until the applicant proves that their application would render the project uneconomic. And in our view, the justifications that have been provided thus far are seriously deficient in that respect. Perhaps a couple of them are fairly obvious, but for the most part, We do not think that the applicant has done a good enough job of explaining why it is that application of many of these standards would in fact render the project uneconomic or impossible to build. A couple of the requests that really just jump out at me as being sort of troubling would be the request for a waiver from the mitigation requirements set forth in the bylaw and regulations. If you have an applicant telling you, you have to give me essentially a blanket waiver from the wetland bylaw, because if you apply this to me, it's going to kill the project dead. And oh, by the way, I shouldn't have to do any mitigation to make up for or protect against the impacts that this project would have, where otherwise they wouldn't be as much of an issue without these waivers. I just can't understand how that's possible. It seems as though the applicant really wants to have it both ways there. And I think Beals and Thomas did a nice job of flagging a number of other requests that really just don't quite add up. It's not entirely clear, for instance, and as has already been discussed by Mr. Gang, why the burden of proof needs to be waived or changed. Why delineation of vernal pool requirements need to be waived, where that's essentially already been done. So what we would ask is that the board, as you really dig into these waiver requests, once you have the additional information you need, take a hard look at what the justifications provided are. If you need more information to be able to determine whether in fact these waiver requests are justified, we would ask the board to request that information and to get it from the applicant before you make a final decision. So at this point, I think that's really all I have to say, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ms. Pyle, would you please state your name and address?
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Pyle. I'm an attorney at Hill Law, and I'm here on behalf of the Manchester Essex Conservation Trust. First, I'd like to second what Mr. Legere just said about the requirement that the board take a hard look at the waivers. And it's not just whether the waivers would make the project uneconomic. It is whether you find that the environmental and other concerns embodied in those waivers outweigh the need for regional housing. And if you find that those environmental and safety and other planning concerns outweigh the need for regional housing, then the waivers should be denied. So again, that's an important point for your consideration. And it's not just whether it's economic, but whether they are necessary for the project to outweigh the need for regional housing. So in addition to that part about the standard, I'd like to present some information for the board's consideration tonight about the environmental impacts. On Monday, we filed a comment letter from Patrick Gardner, a wetland scientist, about the water budget concerning the vernal pools on the site. Mr. Gardner is not able to be here this evening, although hopefully he'll be able to attend the next time the environmental matters are discussed and the applicant's wildlife study and water budget are discussed. But Scott Horsley is here tonight, and he would like to present to the board about his findings concerning the impacts on the vernal pools. And Mr. Horsley has done a groundwater analysis, and I'd ask that the board recognize him. I see that he is up on the screen right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Horsley?
Yes, Madam Chair. With your permission, I just have a few slides. Will take no more than 5 or 7 minutes with your permission. If I may share my screen. I have to be enabled.
You should be able to. Yep, I think I just enabled you.
Okay. And Madam Chair, I presume you can see my title slide here. What I have done, working closely with Pat Garner, is conducted a vernal pool hydrologic impact analysis. My analysis is that I have done to date is of the northern vernal pool, which I'll get into. Pat's letter identifies impacts in both the northern as well as other vernal pools. And I'd like to start with what the standards are, because there are standards. And I might add this, I think as most people know, there are a number of Mass DEP stormwater standards. I served on the original Stormwater Advisory Committee and actually was the one who recommended this standard, so I feel pretty comfortable speaking about it. This is the actual language. The reference is Mass DEP Stormwater Handbook. And what this discusses is where stormwater is infiltrated, as this project intends to do. It's also important to look at the location, as the subtitle says here, evaluate where it is directed. And the idea here is to make sure that we're maintaining the so-called hydrologic regime, and I'll get into that in a minute, what that is, to the various wetlands. And as we all know, this site includes wetlands all around it. So it's a complicated, challenging site to develop for sure. I also highlighted the point here that the Mass DEP Stormwater Handbook does indicate that water budgeting must be employed. And we've done some water budgeting. I have not yet seen the applicant's water budgeting, but perhaps it's coming tomorrow because we're told the report is coming in, and we'll hope to see that because it is required, as it states here. I also want to be clear that the town's regulations discuss this. And as we can see here, section 9.7 specifically talks about vernal pools. And it specifically says, and I'll read the middle sentence, any alteration which impacts topography, soil structure, plant community composition, vegetation, canopy, understory, and then highlighted hydrologic regime, again, drainage patterns, and I'll skip down to the end, shall be presumed to have a significant impact, immediate and cumulative adverse effect. Now, I've put a note down the bottom. There was discussion earlier tonight that some people are not clear on what these terms mean. So I wanted to just suggest that they read this again, because to me, this looks extremely clear. And I'd be happy to discuss with anybody what this means, because I think this is pretty straight language in terms of explaining what significant, what these significant immediate and cumulative adverse effects are, specifically with respect to vernal pool. What it's saying is you can't change the hydrologic regime, you can't alter it, or the drainage patterns. I don't know how much more clear we can make that, but I'd be happy to discuss it if people have further questions. So let me get into the hydrologic analysis that I've done, and I'll indicate this first slide is actually from Pat's letter, because as I said, we've worked together on this. His study, as I said before, looked at both the northern and southern vernal pools. My comments tonight in my letter, which I'll submit shortly to the board, is focused on the northern wetlands specifically. What first thing I did is delineated the watershed to that vernal pool. You can see the, and I'll use my pointer, the highlighted black dots here represent the vernal pool boundary as identified by the applicant. And the base map, as indicated by my references, the existing conditions plan by Allen and Major. So using that information, I was able to delineate the drainage area to the vernal pool. I might add, those familiar with the drainage report, this is slightly different than the applicant's E1 drainage area, which is to the whole northern wetland. What I'm doing is focusing specifically here on the vernal pool. So this is in a way is a subset of the E1 drainage area. And just in terms of defining what I'm going to be talking about here, is I think we all know water levels fluctuate naturally. They are higher during the wet season, which is the spring, and they are lower during the fall. And the reason for that, as I'll get into, is not because of precipitation changes, as you see in some parts of the country, like California. Here in Massachusetts, our precipitation is pretty regular year-round. So something else must be causing this change in water levels. And what it is changes in evapotranspiration. During the summer months, we have plants growing, eating up a lot of water. And the other thing that changes monthly and seasonally is recharge. Now, let me just define recharge. Recharge is the amount of precipitation that gets to the water table or the groundwater system. And that is what affects the groundwater levels. And as we can see here in the picture on the left, some surface water bodies, and vernal pools noted clearly here, are highly dependent on groundwater levels. And just to kind of make it clear, groundwater levels are highly dependent on recharge rates. That's the reason I suggested standard number 3 as part of the state stormwater standards. And I believe that's the reason the town has articulated hydrologic regime in their local regulations, because those of us that are familiar with vernal pool hydrology and ecology know that water is the key here. Without the water or change in patterns, there are clearly going to be alterations to these critical wetland areas. So here is a graph, and I won't take too much time here, but this is evidence to what I was just talking about. These are monthly recharge rates, the amount of water going into the ground. And I just would draw your attention to the mean or average numbers, which are highlighted in the dark color here. You can see that the highest recharge months are March, April, and May. During the summer, June, July, August, September, you can see there's very little recharge, and that's because evapotranspiration is taking off and consuming a lot of the precipitation, or virtually all of it. So what we've done is overlaid the watershed to that vernal pool, the northern vernal pool, on the applicant's watershed, post-development watershed plan. These notations P1 through P17 or so are their various drainage areas. And we can see that the watershed to the northern vernal pool, which is currently largely undeveloped, and is the hydrology of that vernal pool is clearly directly related to the natural recharge rates. Things are going to change under the post-development plan, and that's why the state and the local regulations require an analysis of the water budgeting analysis. And I'm going to show you mine, and hopefully it'll be consistent with when we get the applicant's water budget analysis. What we see when we read the drainage report is some of these drainage areas, the water is being diverted out of the vernal pool watershed to other watersheds. So for example, the P10 water catchment area here, which includes, as you can see, the roof of this building, is directed to this large infiltration system on the south part of the site. So essentially that water, which did fall within this area and recharge and then flow to the vernal pool, now is directed to this infiltration system. And where there are impervious surfaces, the recharge rate essentially goes to zero because no water can infiltrate or recharge into the subsurface. Similarly, you can see the P8 drainage area that's also directed out of the vernal pool watershed down here. And then over here, P5 and P6, which is associated with the entrance drive, is directed out of vernal pool watershed to, I believe it's called rain garden number 2 along the street. So these are 4 instances, or actually a couple of others, but those are the primary ones where we have proposed diversions of water outside of the drainage area. So here is my analysis. What I've done is looked at each one of these catchments. I've calculated the area within the vernal pool watershed. I've noted the so-called routing, meaning where does the stormwater propose to go? And then I've done an analysis for the 3 critical months in the spring, March, April, and May. And I'm totaling, you can see that many of these are 0, and that's because, as I said, for example, P8 is essentially impervious surface, which is being directed to this large infiltration system. So therefore, the post-development recharge goes to 0. And so the sum numbers down the bottom here suggest that under existing conditions, these would be the monthly volumes of recharge. And I might add, these are in cubic feet per month. So 83,000 in March, 19,000 in April, and 18,000 in May. And then we compare that to the proposed condition. In other words, what is left in that catchment after we're diverting the water. And you can see that the net change is shown here as these negative numbers. And then I've computed percentages. So my analysis for the northern pool is suggesting that the change in recharge rate, which I would argue is a direct relate to water table levels and water levels within the vernal pool, ranges from a reduction of 40% to 50%. I would consider those pretty significant changes, and I'd be interested in other wetlands scientists' impression on whether or not those numbers are significant, but I'll leave it at that. I think they're quite significant. And again, just as a reminder here, this type of analysis, hydrologic regime, is required under the state standard, and it is also required under the local bylaw. So I think this is something that needs to be taken into account. And I do think this does directly go to the earlier discussion I heard tonight about whether or not there are significant immediate cumulative adverse effects. I guess I understand why the applicant wants to waive that, because if one needs to comply with that, we have a problem here, in my opinion. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
And if I may continue, Patrick Gardner wasn't able to be here tonight to discuss his findings, but his report that we submitted on Monday the 6th says that there are going to be similar impacts concerning the surface water hydrology. In particular, the volume of stormwater entering the northern vernal pool decreases by 63%, and the volume of stormwater entering the southern vernal pool decreases by 27%. So Mr. Horsley has said that groundwater is going to be reduced for the northern pool. Patrick Gardner has made similar findings for surface water. And there's a real question here about whether these pools will be viable for the wildlife once this project is built, or whether they will dry up too quick, or whether they will have sufficient standing water to support the populations of the salamanders and the other amphibians that use them. So we have serious questions about whether this project is even going to be permittable under the Wetlands Protection Act. And we would ask that the peer reviewer take these findings into consideration. And just to reiterate what Mr. Horsley said, there's a requirement here that the water budget be sustained post-development. And we don't see any evidence that there has been any effort to meet that standard. And not only is that a requirement under the stormwater standard that Mr. Horsley cited, but it's also present in the decisional case law from DEP's Office of Appeals and Dispute Resolution. So these are important considerations. There's been no effort to meet them. And the way the project is currently designed, it looks like the vernal pools will not be viable for wildlife habitat and vernal pool habitat going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms.
Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Engler, do you have a response?
Madam Chair, I'll wait until all the comments are in before.
Okay. Okay. Mr. McMillan, would you please state your name and address?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Alan McMillan, Rockport, Mass., a 35-year member of the Rockport Conservation Commission, 12 years as chairman. In my 35 years on the Concom, we never had any project in town. We've had individual homes and redevelopments, developments. We've never had more than 3 requests for waivers. Usually it's 1. To have 19 requests for waivers right off the bat signifies there's a problem. I would like to go back and explain in layman's terms what a vernal pool is and why communities all across the Commonwealth put protective areas around it. I think it was Stacy did correctly say that under state law, they only protect the vernal pool itself, but a vernal pool is simply a breeding ground for many creatures that go into the water to breed. They live in the surrounding land. Rockport has a 100-foot bylaw barrier around a vernal pool to protect it. Manchester has 150-foot. That area is critical to the survival of the pool. You destroy that area, remove the tree cover, remove the ground, damage the ground, and no life exists. And then I would also like to add, several speakers have mentioned water runoff. The last man, Mr. Abrams, I guess it was, talked about the water being removed and sent to a different area. All of that water that will be running off the property, no one's even mentioned this, will be filled with road salt in the winter, as will the steep drive up the hill in the sidewalk. That sidewalk coming up the hill in the afternoon in the winter will be in the shade. They'll have to dump a lot of salt to make that. All of that salt will be running into various watersheds, into various pools. So I think that's all a critical part of this, is addressing all those water issues, which can't be done the way the project is set up. Had one more comment here. Yeah, the thing that disturbs me as much as everything else, and I'm a frequent walker through the woods, is the carbon footprint of this project. There will be over 1,000 tons of rock blasted. There will be acres of tree cut down, which provide oxygen, shelter for wildlife, shelter for the vernal pools. No one's talking about this, although at a previous hearing, I did hear about the numerous loads of dump trucks going down the street. So think about that. We're destroying a major part of Manchester's heritage, Manchester's sanctuary, if you will, for the profit of a corporation that lives out, that is out of town and has no vested interest in the community. Thank you for listening to my comments. I think this is a very poor project for the town of Manchester, even though I don't live here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McMillan. Ms. Gersh, please state your name and address.
Yes, Karen Gersh, Essex, Mass. I'm some of the things that Alan McMillan has just said were what I was going to say. However, I think it bears repeating, is that we already have a sanctuary up there in the natural environment that exists on Shingle Place Hill and has been there forever. And here we have someone that is coming along and proposing this huge project and is calling it a sanctuary, which is a pseudo sanctuary. The construction of SLV's housing project on Shingle Place Hill will commit ecocide. The actions from this project will destroy the natural environment that now exists by deliberate and negligent human activity. And the destruction of Shingle Place Hill will impact not only that site, those 20+ acres, but forever will alter the surrounding acreage. The applicant is asking if he can demolish an existing natural environment. It's a huge project and will make a huge man-made footprint. It will never fit into these surroundings. There are so many projects that we can see around as we drive down 95 and larger communities, miles of commercial development and apartment complexes that already exist in built-up heavy traffic areas. There must be other places that are appropriate to build this project of 130+ units. The Shingle Place Hill housing project proposed by SLV is out of place for our community, for the site, and it will destroy what is beautiful, unspoiled, and natural already. If it's approved, it will be too late to speak up. And I'm speaking now to the 90 people who are on Zoom tonight, that they have one more chance with the next meeting on the 22nd of June to speak up or write something to the paper and get the word out, because if you approve this, it will be too late. Thank you so much for hearing me.
Thank you, Ms. Gersh. And I just want to remind people that the voters of Manchester voted to put this in the limited commercial district. They did not take any opportunity to preserve it as open space. So it makes it very difficult for us because it hasn't been properly preserved, as I feel it should have been, but that didn't happen. And the voters didn't do that. So people need to keep that in mind. Mr. Engler.
I'm not muted, am I, Madam Chair?
Nope.
I'll bounce around here a little bit. I want to be brief because I know we're getting late into the evening. One, I'll just say we're very comfortable that we meet all Wetlands Protection Act standards and all state standards for that matter. Beals and Thomas, who's an objective peer reviewer on this process, I don't think has identified any deficiencies relative to our state standards. Granted, they've identified some questions relative to some waivers from local standards, but we feel very confident we comply with all state standards. Also, I would take great exception to Councillor Pyle's recommendation that just see, what local wetlands requirements you think are important, and those will outweigh the need for affordable housing. That's exactly wrong. Because Manchester by the Sea is under 10%, the state looks at it that the need for affordable housing outweighs local concerns unless it's so onerous or so outrageous. And look at the case law. I would ask offline for your Mr. Pucci, who I'm sure is advising you. It's clear as day. So it's not so simple. And this comment is as much for the people on the Zoom as it is for the board, who I know is well informed. It's just not so simple as, oh, we want to preserve and we want to adhere to all our local wetlands requirements and local environmental bylaws. In the eyes of the state, Manchester by the Sea is under 10%. And candidly, whether the town wants to hear it or not, that puts the leverage in the position or possession of the applicant. It just does. And I know the town is in a difficult position of having to weigh everything, but it's not so simple as just saying, oh yeah, this we don't like this, or we need to adhere to this waiver. On appeal, that's not going to hold the day. And to Mr. Legier's comment that we can't build the project without these waivers. We can't build the roadway. You know, my business is 40B. This would be the easiest uneconomic economic discussion ever, because it's not like, oh, we just lose a few units or they're making us do something expensive. It's zero sum. It's 0 units or it's 136 units, because we can't build the roadway to access this project, the roadway that we've looked exhaustively at for 9 months. So it's pretty simple from that perspective relative to, you know, what the considerations are. Also, and this isn't, you will get the CMP clearing, blasting. It seemed like that was okay for the Black Earth composting facility and Memorial School and other things that have been done, not so in the distant past in the town, when there was blasting, when there was clearing, when there were waivers from local wetland bylaws. All those were granted to get those two developments built. So we feel comfortable, Madam Chair, with what we've submitted and provided. Additional information is coming, and we look forward to wrapping up the discussion. I am joined by Scott Goddard tonight, who just has a couple comments on some of the things that Mr. Horsley raised, as well as Carlton Quinn from Allen and Major, our civil engineer, who would also like to comment briefly on some of the technical assertions that were made. So Scott or Carlton, I don't care who speaks first, but why don't you guys take the floor?
This is Scott Goddard. I'm on the phone, so I hope you can all hear me. Could you please confirm if you can hear me okay?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Goddard.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I do agree with the comments that Mr. Engler has made. The wildlife report is complete and is being submitted tomorrow, and that will go a long way, I think, to dispel and lay to rest some of the concerns relative to the presumed impacts to vernal pools and vernal pool habitats. This project has gone out of its way to be sited in such a way that does protect not only the vernal pools themselves, where there is no direct impact proposed at all in vernal pools, but all of their primary and the overwhelming majority of the secondary habitat that's important to those vernal pools surrounding habitat. So we, as a professional staff of wildlife experts, will be able to represent confidently that that's satisfied, to the extent that the Manchester by the Sea Wetlands Protection Bylaw is applicable to these proceedings. Our report, I believe, satisfactorily addresses that. The one part of our report that it will not be consistent with this dialogue is in direct response to the Horsley Witten and Patrick Garner observations on water budget. Carlton Quinn, who is the design engineer, has addressed that issue to satisfactorily, in my opinion, to demonstrate that we're matching watersheds substantially to the pre-existing conditions to have confidence that our drainage modifications to the site will not have significant changes to the hydro period or overall water contributions to those vernal pools. In my brief review of the report submitted by the consultants hired to oppose this project, seemed to have a number of skewed presumptions, and I think with some further time and analysis, we could demonstrate that. As a brief example to that, I would point out that the watersheds, as mapped out in their water budget analysis, are skewed to only looking at percentages of the overall watershed relative to the project, not the overall watersheds to those vernal pools. And what that does is it artificially weights the area of our project to make it seem a larger contribution than it is to the overall vernal pools. Therefore, these numbers of diminished water contributions are skewed to make the numbers look higher. And I think it's unreasonable and unfair professional representation to present that. So I would ask that the board considers to have its own reviewer, Beals and Thomas in this case, give an independent assessment and see if the Horsley, Witt, and Patrick Gardner comments have any weight. And myself and the applicant's team would be happy to respond to any assumed gaps of data that have been presented to this board. We are very confident, as stated by Jeff, that this project overwhelmingly meets all state law requirements of the Wetland Protection Act. These wetlands and vernal pools are protected 100% under the standards of the Wetland Protection Act, with no doubt. This project will be subject to a notice of intent, and I'm 100% confident in the ability to obtain a valid order of conditions or superseding order of conditions on its applicability to the Wetland Protection Act. As far as the bylaw goes, our report that you'll have in your hands very shortly will demonstrate that we have made substantial and dramatic efforts to protect those interests as well, and this project can be confidently approved by the ZBA as it relates to wetland protection. But I would like Carlton to comment just briefly on the water budget analysis done by the opposition. Thank you.
Mr. Quinn?
Good evening, Madam Chairman. Carlton Quinn, Allen Major Associates. I just want to reiterate some of Scott's comments where the Horsley watershed just showed the southerly surface area to that northerly vernal pool, because the northerly watershed to that is Sawmill Brook, which probably has dozens of square miles of watershed that would feed that. I mean, even to the point that our design team doesn't know if that vernal pool ever gets dry because it's just being continually fed from the river. We have a substantial amount of groundwater recharge proposed for this site, which would provide a more sustainable groundwater flow to that vernal pool than surface water. We can certainly provide more surface flow to that, but it's our professional opinion that providing that water to the ground is a more sustainable water source because it's not open to evaporation. To the southerly vernal pool, we provided a surface drainage area almost exactly the same as what is currently going to that site. And we've also provided analysis that shows only 10,000 square feet of the 250,000 square feet to go to that is going to be paved, which would be limiting the groundwater. And that entire area is getting infiltrated into the ground within the same watershed of that vernal pool. So there's no loss of water flow to those vernal pools. And that was provided in the last response, I think, in the Chesia letter. So we're more than confident that we're providing adequate water, surface water, and groundwater to both of those vernal pools, and we've provided that data to this date. And I think on Mr. Horsley's second slide, he didn't note the last sentence of that requirement that water budgeting isn't required if the recharge is provided in the same sub-watershed as the vernal pool. So those were my thoughts, just hearing them for the first time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Carol Bundy, would you please state your name and address? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. My name is Carol Bundy and I live at 18 Proctor Street. And I'm just speaking as a citizen. Obviously, I have none of the expertise of all the various people that have spoken. So I just wanted to voice what I feel, which is that this project teeters on the edge of acceptability environmentally and in other ways. And Mr. Engler spoke tonight about it providing affordable housing, but I wish it was providing truly affordable housing. I think the way that there's so much bureaucratic or picayune detail that we're all arguing about, even down to the point of what kind of affordable housing that's being provided. I suppose what I'm saying is I wish I believed there was something good about this project, because it risks so many aspects of our community life. And I fail at this point to see one good thing that this project offers the town. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mundy. Steve Gang?
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just wanted to correct one of Mr. Engler's contentions. In fact, no waivers were requested from any local bylaws, and none were granted in considering the new memorial school, the new regional high school, or the Black Earth compost site at the landfill. In other words, those sites submitted fully to all of the standards governing vernal pools and other wetland resources, all the standards regarding levels of proof, all the bylaw standards regarding mitigation, and where appropriate replication. And as a result, they are better projects. I also, while I have a moment, wanted to point out that Mr. Engler's contention that if local environmental bylaws were fully enforced, that many of the recent 40B projects would not have been built. I agree with that 100%, but I think it's exactly the wrong conclusion. The right way to look at this, as uncovered by the Tufts School of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning and by CHAPA, the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, in researching 40B developments, I believe, is that many of them, especially large-scale ones, are choosing to go to environmentally sensitive sites, partly because those are remaining large sites because nobody else can build on them, and also because they're cheap. Because they're restricted, the land values are depressed. So no surprise, 40B with the weaponry of being able to eliminate local bylaws for zoning, planning, and wetlands protection gravitate toward those. And I think that's the proper interpretation of the recent trend in large-scale 40B. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pyle and Mr. Horsley, I've already heard from you tonight. I'm not going to have a back and forth between you and the applicant's consultants. I think that you've stated your opinion, and we'll leave it at that. Anyone else from the Marilyn Cobus, please state your name and address.
Everyone, my name is Marilyn Cobus, and I'm at 2 Bell Court. Like
you've got to do something with your sound. You're on both a phone and a PC. You need to shut something down.
Yep, we're trying to do that.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how to do that.
Sarah, you may have to mute yourself in order for her to be heard clearly for the time she's speaking.
I'll try again. How's that? No. Oh boy. Hold on.
Do you have both a laptop and a phone going?
I just tried to turn something down, and that didn't work at all. So I'm not sure what to do. I realize I'm not audible at this point, so I will just defer.
Okay. We'll be talking about environmental again on July 13th.
I'll try to figure it out by then. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
Do you have your cell phone on?
Any other member of the public wish to speak? Mike Rosmarin, please state your name and address.
Madam Chair, Mike Ross Marin, Crooked Lane, Manchester, Mass. I just have a simple procedural question. My understanding is that there's only one more public hearing. Is that correct?
No, at the beginning of this meeting, Mr. Engler agreed to extend the public hearing through July 28th. So we will be having a meeting on June 22nd, July 13th, and July 27th.
Thank you. I appreciate that. My only concern is that as a layperson, I've been unable to keep score, but when Beals and Thomas was doing the presentation, Ms. Minahan, it almost appeared to be that half of what she needed to address, she couldn't because of the absence of this wildlife report. So therefore, it almost made this meeting moot because no one can comment on it. That's my only comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I will close off public comment tonight, and I will make a motion to continue the public hearing on the 40B application of SLV School Street LLC at School Street Assessors Map number 43, lot number 18, filed with the town clerk on September 27th, 2021. I will continue the public hearing to June 22nd, 2022 at 7 p.m. Do I have a second?
Madam Chair, before the board votes, just so I'm prepared and invite all the right people, the 22nd is going to be the completion of the peer review architecture, correct?
Correct.
And will there be, what other items are on the agenda that night if known?
We will probably circle back around on some of the conditions and waivers.
Okay, and possibly some of the water and sewer information that's coming in, or is that going to be into July?
That will need to be into July because that report's not in yet. Yeah.
All right, so, okay, I just wanted to make sure we're prepared. Thank you. Apologize for the interruption.
Okay. Do I have a second on my motion?
Second.
Jim seconds. I'll take a roll call vote. Brian?
Yes.
Sean?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Catherine?
Approve.
And Sarah approves. Great, thank you. We'll now move on to administrative matters.
I'll say good night, Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
See you next time.
We have minutes to review from April 13th. Did people have an opportunity to review those?
I did.
Do I have a motion to approve them?
Make a motion.
Sean moves to approve them. Do I have a second?
Second.
Brian seconds. Any discussion? I'll take a roll call vote. Brian?
Yes.
Sean?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Jim wasn't present, so he won't vote. Catherine?
I can I abstain? I didn't get all the way through them.
Sure.
And I don't. Sorry, when
Okay.
the other report came in, I got
Okay.
sidetracked by that.
And Sarah approves the minutes, so those are approved. Any other questions from the board? Are we clear with the schedule?
In my opinion, Sarah, the schedule is clear. I think you've done a magnificent job. My issue that I've been struggling with is we've had a number of peer reviewers review things. And it's never, in my opinion, completely clear as to where they stand on a lot of them. Some of them they have to hold off because the information has not been pages of information when just it would be a lot easier if they would simply say that it's okay or it's not okay. There's an awful lot to go through and plow through here, and sometimes it's not clear.
Right, and I think that they're making recommendations on the waiver, which is what they're charged with doing. I think that we're going to need to go back through the various peer reviews and look and see. I mean, there are certain conditions contained in those peer reviews. And we need to circle back around and see if we want to affirm the conditions that they were putting in and that the applicant was agreeable to doing. And that we're going to need to start doing that.
Well, thank you for that.
Okay. It's not easy. It's a lot of information. Anybody else have something? Then it's on to the Celtics. I will make a motion to adjourn. Do I have
I
a
will
second?
second it.
Jim will second. I'll take a roll call vote. Brian,
Yes.
Sean,
Yes.
John,
True, yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Catherine.
Yeah.
And Sarah votes yes. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
It's over 2 hours.